The next step in the system is to find the right property in the right area. So, for example, if your goal is income, and your strategy will be principally buy and hold for income, more than likely you'll be looking for high-yielding property to produce cash flow. As a rough rule of thumb, high-yielding property tends to be cheap property or cheaper property, and so now we're beginning to get an idea of what we should be looking for. On the other hand, if your goal is to build equity or wealth, and your strategy is to buy and hold for equity, more than likely you'll be looking for lower-yielding property. Lower-yielding property tends to be higher value property, and as a rough rule of thumb, all other things being equal, we can assume that higher value property is more likely to enjoy greater capital growth over any given period than cheaper property. You'd be surprised how many investors lose sight of this in the excitement of trying to buy a bargain. I often meet investors who bemoan the fact they can't live off the cash flow of their properties, but they've bought expensive properties in expensive areas with low yields and which are relatively hard to rent out. Likewise, I come across investors who jump at buying cheap properties because they can afford them, but who then bemoan the lack of capital growth or the limited capital growth. Once we know the type of property that we're looking for, we can then start to identify areas where we're likely to find that property. And not every area is suitable for all strategies. Now, I know that the ideal is to buy within your local area, but sometimes, being pragmatic, you may just have to go further afield. Many investors head north looking for yield, but you wouldn't do the same necessarily if you were buying for future capital growth. Although I'm sure that all areas of the country will enjoy capital growth at some time, if you look at the statistics, which are admittedly just averages, you can see that some regions, towns and suburbs historically perform better than other regions, towns and suburbs. So there is a view that you should follow the trend and buy in those areas for future capital growth. But you'd be surprised how many investors I find who are determined to make their strategy work in their chosen area. I come across investors who are desperate to try and create income. They choose an area, possibly an area close to where they live, but where they're going to find it very, very difficult to find cheap property to produce the yield that they want. Despite the fact that they spend months and months looking for the ideal high-yielding property, they stubbornly refuse to change areas. Sometimes you just have to accept your strategy isn't going to work in that area and move on. Now, there are always exceptions to the rule. We all know about buying the cheapest house in the best street. And it may be that if you do enough groundwork and legwork, you may find cheap properties in good areas which produce the yield you're after. But as a general rule of thumb, if you're after yield, you need to go to the cheap areas. And if you're after capital growth, you need to buy in the better areas. What I suggest you don't do, which is again something many investors do, is sit on the fence. And they buy their properties in what we could consider to be middle-of-the-road areas, which are neither cheap nor expensive, and where they'll benefit from neither a decent yield nor a decent rate of capital growth. By heading slightly towards the extremes, but not all the way to the extremes, they'll greatly increase their return depending upon their strategy. Looking ahead to the next steps of the process, we'll be looking for properties which we can buy cheap or where we can add value, or preferably which we can buy cheap and add value. And I don't mean buying cheap properties cheap, I mean buying properties at below their true market value, regardless of how much or how little they cost or are worth. I believe that the quality of any deal that we do reflects the depth and the thoroughness of our due diligence and research. And the more research we do, the more likely it is that we'll find bargains and find the properties that fit our strategy. One of the key things is to believe that the right deals are out there and to be persistent when looking for them. If you look at enough properties, you will find them. And in the next video, we'll be looking at the fourth step in the system: find, negotiate, finance and buy your property. So I'll see you in the next video.